Hello, everybody, and welcome to our lecture on early childhood cognitive development. This corresponds with Chapter 9 of your textbook. We've broken up today's lecture into 4 parts. This will be our first part on the cognitive theories of Piaget. So, Piaget focused on developing those stages of thinking that you may recall from our early coverage of Chapter 2 on theories. We've discussed how in infancy and toddlerhood, their cognitive stage was referred to as the sensory motor period, where the young child is basically gathering information from their world and coordinating their senses with their motor system. In the preschool years, sort of vaguely between the ages of 2 and 6, we have what Piaget called the pre-operational stage of cognitive development. The primary theme of this stage is that the child can now begin to think in symbols. And this process of learning how to have something represent something else, like a letter represents a sound or a number represents a quantity, that kind of symbolic thought is a critical element to what it means to be fully human. Because once we have symbolic thought, we can develop an imagination. We can play in ways that we couldn't before because we can do things that don't just involve the objects in front of us. And we also develop the ability to communicate with each other, whether it's through speaking or through writing, literacy, typing. So symbolic thought is absolutely essential for our full cognitive development as human beings and first emerges in the early childhood period. Now, Piaget suggested that while we're focused on symbolic thought, our overall ability to reason is not particularly well developed in the early childhood years. In fact, we start to make a couple of very predictable errors which can kind of get in the way of our understanding how to use logical reasoning. So some of the obstacles to logic that Piaget identified are centration, focus on appearance, static reasoning, and irreversibility. I'm going to define each of these in turn. So centration is when a young child focuses or centers on one idea and basically eliminates considering all the others. So for example, young children are often described as egocentric. In other words, they focus on their own needs more than they are able to think about others. This is an example of centrism in the sense that the child is focusing on himself or herself. Appearance is when a child is focusing on what something might look like, the appearance of it, and ignores all the other attributes. So early on, a child may not be able to distinguish many different objects if the only way that child's thinking about it is how it looks on the surface. Static reasoning is defined as basically applying the idea that nothing will ever change, that whatever the child sees now, whatever's happening now, has always been and always will be. Piaget suggested that because young children are stuck in this static reasoning, that everything is the same and always will be, they become distressed when there are unexpected changes in their environment. They also have some limits to problem solving because they can't quite recognize that there could be a new way to solve a problem that isn't right in front of them. And then lastly, the other part of early childhood reasoning that gets in the way of developing logic is referred to as irreversibility. And this is the idea that most young children assume that once something has been done in a certain way, it can't change, it can't be undone. So, for example, consider a child who has maybe built a tower and it gets knocked down and they get upset. The child may not realize that, hey, you can build that tower again. So these 4 characteristics of pre-operational thought lead to some classic thinking errors, and some of these can be illustrated in one of the more famous Piagetian tasks, which we refer to as the conservation task. Now, the conservation task is basically all about the idea that if you have a certain substance, like this pitcher of liquid, it's going to be still the same amount of substance even if it looks different. So an adult would understand that if you pour the same liquid into a short glass as you pour into a tall glass, it's still the same amount of liquid, whereas a young child will make what's called the conservation error and will assume that the liquid in the tall glass is more than the liquid in the small glass. So returning back then to the previous slide, which I can't do, sorry to say, we then can see that children's errors in logical thinking can result in these errors in conservation. And this can actually be broken down, and cognitive psychologists have studied how children get to their understanding of number and matter and length. So while Piaget made a lot of contributions to our understanding of how children in the early childhood years think, there are also some limitations to his theories. People since his work was published in the 40s, 50s, and 60s have looked back and said, I wonder how much of these thought errors are actually related more to the young child's limits in language than they are to understanding the logic of conservation. So scientists suggested that Piaget's work is limited by not considering the language demands of some of these cognitive tasks. And in fact, when people changed up the tasks, made them more engaging, a little simpler language-wise and more playful, children can do better. So it is quite possible that Piaget has underestimated what young children can reason about, based on the way he structured the tasks and based on how he didn't really consider what language can do to add to the challenge, as well as to help a child resolve these tasks. So that concludes our section on what's most important to know about Piagetian thought in the early childhood period. It'll be very important for you to understand that this is the period of pre-operational thinking, and that pre-operational thinking is all about the development of symbolic thought. And that as a child's symbolic thought gets better, language will get more complex, and that logical reasoning will continue to improve over time. When we get to the section on middle childhood, you'll see just how much better it gets when we leave the preschool period. So thank you for your time and attention.